Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Assessing Risks under the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, How Far in the Chain of Activities. My name is Valentina Bolognesi. I'm Senior Advocacy and Engagement Advisor at Amfori, and it is really my pleasure to welcome so many of you today. So thank you again very much for the interest that you show for the work that we do, a work that is jointly organized with the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles and also with the support of the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights. Quickly taking a look at the housekeeping rules for the day while we wait for other people to join. You are all muted, but we really do encourage you to engage with us throughout the whole duration of the webinar. Do use the Q&A function to post your questions, and we're going to have a dedicated Q&A towards the end of the webinar where we will try to address many of the questions that you have asked us. As always, the webinar is being recorded, and the recordings alongside the slides will be shared after the webinar. We're also going to share a satisfaction survey, and the idea is for you to give us feedback and let us know what you thought of the webinar so that we can do better next time. What to expect out of today's webinar? I'm going to briefly make some introductory remarks, and then I will hand over to Michaela Streibelt from the Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights. She will unpack what risk analysis looks like under the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Wherever possible, she will also try to draw some parallelism with the German Supply Chain Act. And then we're going to move into the practical side of things with my colleague Raffaella Brito Marcellino from Amfori. She will give us an example of how the journey of an Amfori member looks like when trying to understand risks and impacts at the level of the environment. Then we're gonna move on to Melina Kunde from the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles and Johannes Norport from CNA. They will share with us the PST approach to transparency and also CNA's journey to improving transparency of their supply chains. Then, as alluded to, we're gonna have a Q&A session and some closing remarks. In terms of, if you could move to the next slide, please. In terms of introduction, as a reminder, today's webinar is coming as part of a series of webinars on due diligence laws and practice. You are most welcome also to go back to the recordings of this webinar. And the idea is that we will continue unpacking aspects of emerging due diligence requirements. Therefore, do keep an eye out for the work that we do in the future. I always find it helpful also to remind ourselves of where we are currently with the process of application of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. The directive entered into force on the 25th of July this year, and we are currently at the stage where the EU member states will kickstart or have just kickstarted the process of transposing the text nationally. Because it is a directive, the text will need to be transposed into national legislation, and there is a deadline by which the member states will need to have completed this process, and that is the 26th of July 2026. The rules will only start to apply to a certain category, so a certain group of companies as of July 2027, and then the personal scope of the directive will be progressively expanded moving forward. Something important that is going to happen also between now and July and January 2027 is quite some guidance development work by the European Commission. If we take a look at the text of the CSDDD, there is a very long list of guidelines that will need to be developed by the European Commission, really to complement and to clarify and to specify certain aspects of the CSDDD. Guidelines will, for instance, cover aspects such as identification of risks, prioritization, conflict-affected and high-risk areas, stakeholder engagement, and others. Of course, those guidance documents are very important, but the message I think that we want to also convey to companies is that it's good to get started now with preparing for the application of the CSDDD, because as a reminder, CSDDD actually has at the core the notion of risk-based due diligence, which is not a novel notion, it actually builds very much from relevant international standards on due diligence, on RBC due diligence, such as the UNGPs and the OECD M&E guidelines, or the ILO tripartite declaration of principles concerning multinational enterprises. Therefore, there is already quite some solid basis to get started with also understanding more broadly what due diligence, risk-based due diligence looks like. We can discuss, of course, as to the points of differences between the due diligence and the CSDDD requirements and the international frameworks. But I think it's important to convey the message that there is quite a lot of common ground. If we could move to the next slide, please, it's just a reminder of the fact that indeed the notion of due diligence, risk-based due diligence, is embedded in instruments such as the OECD M&E guidelines or RBC guidance, where basically due diligence is the tool for companies to identify the kind of risks that they are connected to, risks to people and the environment. And then once this understanding is there, also to determine actually who is responsible for those, to what extent did I as a company contribute to the negative impact, or did I cause it, or was I directly linked? So the involvement level, the involvement notion, which is slightly different in CSDDD, is key to then determine what kind of actions do I need to put in place as a company to manage those risks. If we could move to the next slide, please. So to determine basically the nature of the risks and also the involvement of a company with those risks, of course, supply chain mapping is a key component, because only by understanding the actors and where, for instance, the products come from, what kind of processes are involved in the making of certain products or services, will I be able then to have this overview of risks that I am connected to through my supply chain. Of course, it's easier said than done. And I think with the help of our speakers today, we're also going to touch upon the complexity of getting further visibility along the supply chain. But this remains a key component to getting that level of understanding of risks exposure. The OECD also recommends that actually companies start with a risk scoping, which is a way to really get a general overview of priority risk areas in the supply chain. And this risk scoping exercise should be conducted through the lens of 4 dimensions: sector risks, enterprise level risks, geographic risks, and product risks. Last but not least, if we could move to the next slide, I just wanted also to remind the audience that the OECD has developed quite some sectorial guidance on specific risks that are applicable to certain sectors and supply chains, including the mitigation measures that should be adopted for those specific sectors. I think those are always very practical and useful documents to refer to while companies get started with their due diligence, and while also waiting for additional guidance to be provided by the European Commission. That's all I wanted to cover in terms of introductory remarks, and now I'm very happy to hand over to Michaela Streibelt, advisor at the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights, for her to tell us more about actually what the CSDDD stipulates. Thank you, Misha. Over to you.
Thanks very much for the invitation and for the introductory words that are actually really helpful to set the stage now for my presentation on risk analysis in the context of the CSDDD and transparency in the supply chain. Let's skip the next slide. That's a copyright. You can have a look at it later when you want to use the slides. You can find out how to do that, and some quick words on the German Helpdesk on business and human rights. We are a support service from the German government, and we provide initial consultation, referral advice, and awareness raising. We are financed by the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. On the next slide, very briefly, an overview of our services. So I've mentioned the free of charge advice already. That's not the only thing we're doing. We're also helping with training programs. We have our own events. We attend events of other organizations like today. And we have by now a very vast portfolio of online tools, online services. You can see the orange highlighted and underlined words are hyperlinks. When you handed out the slides later on, I invite you to check them out. I find they're all incredibly helpful to implement risk-based due diligence in supply chains. Yes, starting with the actual topic of today's presentation, the risk management system, risk analysis under the CSDDD. And you can see on this slide that actually the risk management system that the CSDDD describes is very similar to the OECD 6-step due diligence framework that Valentina just presented. And just to have a look at where we are, we're talking about the risk analysis today. And you can see that we've integrated the climate plan into this risk management system. That's not entirely correct under the CSDDD. It's kind of outside of this framework, but we've put in the center, and I'll explain this a little bit more in detail later on, stakeholder engagement, because the engagement with stakeholders, rights holders, so actually not investors, is at the heart of the due diligence process, because the due diligence process serves the protection of their interests, and also risk analysis is actually not possible without engaging with stakeholders. So where do companies have these due diligence obligations, and where do they have to conduct a risk analysis? They have to do that in the so-called chain of activities. And the chain of activities is a little bit different to the supply chain of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, because it covers not only upstream actors and upstream processes, but also in a little bit of a limited way downstream. And the chain of activities encompasses a company and its own operations. You can see this in the center. So basically all controlled subsidiaries are always part of the chain of activities. And then it also encompasses business partners, both upstream and downstream, and both direct and indirect business partners. And you might know from the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act that it differentiates between direct and indirect business partners or suppliers, and only sets forth obligations if there is a certain degree of knowledge of an impact at an indirect supplier's level. And the CSDDD does not follow this approach, that both encompasses direct and indirect business partners, but the criteria of appropriateness under the CSDDD might lead to the type of measures that are required in relation to an indirect business partners, and the intensity of the measures in relation to an indirect business partner to be different. And I'll also explain this in a little bit. Downstream, I've mentioned, is limited. It only encompasses, you can see it on the slide, distribution, transport, and storage, and then only if it is for or on behalf of the obliged company. Looking at the risk analysis. So risk analysis is a procedure to identify, prioritize potential and actual negative impacts. The CSDDD, as well as the German Supply Chain Act, describe a risk-based approach. And the CSDDD actually spells out this risk-based approach in more detail and is more specific in this respect. The risk analysis must be based on quantitative and qualitative information, and companies must use appropriate resources. And in relation to the steps of the risk analysis, companies should start with a mapping. We've heard from Valentina the 4 dimensions of the risk scoping of the OECD that might come in very, very helpful in this context. But starting with a mapping, companies map operations of business partners, of their own operations in a chain of activities, to identify areas where negative impacts are likely and severe. So we see already here a recourse to the risk-based approach, taking recourse to the criteria, severity and likelihood of occurrence. And then based on this mapping, companies do an in-depth assessment of individual business partners or supply chains. So companies need to prioritize those areas of their supply chains and those supply chains where negative impacts are more likely, and also more likely to be more severe, instead of just rolling out everything to everyone, as we've seen as more of a bad practice example from the German context quite often. The CSDDD in this context also has some rules that are aimed at reducing the burden on business partners of obliged companies. You can see it on the slide. obliged companies shall prioritize obtaining information from the business partner where they expect the negative impact to the extent that this is possible. So this might also allow companies to directly turn towards an indirect business partner. But in this context, we need to remind ourselves of how effective such behavior could be and how meaningful this procedure could be. The CSDDD also further prioritizes the risk-based approach by requiring companies to prioritize negative impacts only according to likelihood of occurrence and severity of the impact. In the context of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, companies are only required to prioritize according to appropriateness. So the appropriateness criteria of the CSDDD are linked more closely to individual obligations under the CSDDD. Yes, and this is actually what I'm going to explain with the next slide. So appropriateness and the CSDDD, and in this context, companies need to do appropriate due diligence, need to do an appropriate measures, need to do an appropriate risk analysis. And in the context of the CSDDD really spells out which criteria are relevant in relation to which obligation, which element of due diligence. And the general definition of appropriateness includes both effectiveness criteria and appropriateness criteria. You can see on the left-hand slide the general appropriateness criteria. So it means, first of all, they must be effective, so they must be capable of actually addressing the impact. Then they must be commensurate to severity and likelihood of occurrence and reasonably available to the company. So you can see already here that appropriateness criteria that we know from the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, like leverage and contributions to an impact, are missing here. Prioritization, I've mentioned this already, only according to severity and likelihood of occurrence. But ability to influence, leverage, and contributions are not irrelevant, but they don't play a role in the context of risk analysis or prioritization. The recitals are actually really clear. Companies are not to prioritize according to ability to influence and contributions, only severity and likelihood of occurrence. But of course, ability to influence and contributions play a role, and they play a role when it comes to measures. And in particular, when we're thinking about this, the chain of activities and the German notion of the supply chain, thinking about the differentiation between direct and indirect supplier, we can see that the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act has more of a black and white yes and no approach, where either you have substantiated knowledge, then you have due diligence obligations in the deeper supply chain, whereas the CSDDD, by taking recourse to the ability to influence and contributions that are different in the deeper supply chain versus in relation to a direct supplier versus in your own operations, where these are most strongly pronounced, takes more of a gradual approach, where the stronger influence and contributions are, the more is expected, or different types of measures are expected from companies. And then as a leverage decreases, companies are expected to come up with different types of measures. First start maybe with measures that are aimed at increasing leverage, and then also contributions understood as limiting the efforts of a company in relation to measures, how intensely they have to conduct measures. They might also be decreasing the deeper you go into the supply chain. This is obviously not always the case. There are also situations in which a company might have a lot of leverage also in the deeper supply chain and might have contributed a lot in the deeper supply chain. But as a general understanding, we have this gradual due diligence in the deeper supply chain under the CSDDD in the chain of activities, whereas in the German Supply Chain Act, we have this more yes and no approach. I've mentioned that prioritization only has to only be based on severity and likelihood of occurrence. And you can see here an example that we made with what we call a risk matrix. This is obviously very, very simplified, but just to help you get a better understanding of how you could prioritize according to these criteria. And you can also find some explanations on what is severity. This is actually very aligned. The CSDDD generally is very aligned with the UNGP and the OECD guidance. So severity consists of scale, scope, and reversibility. So how severe how severe is the impact, how many people are affected, or how big is the area of the environment affected, and then reversibility. Obviously, is it reversible? But not only yes, no, but also like how big are the efforts to be made? How difficult is it to reverse the impact? And then likelihood of occurrence is more the potential of this impact actually to come into existence. And we've worked here with some examples that we made up. Obviously, you can't generally say that there's always a problem with chemical safety and safe handling of chemicals in Vietnam when it comes to plastics. You would have to analyze how high the severity is and how high the likelihood of occurrence is based on the individual circumstances of this particular case. You would have to actually look at like what's going on in the facility, what are they actually doing to identify this. And the same is true in relation to all the other examples we are making. So ores, China, land rights, or packaging, working conditions in Romania, sales, working time in Germany. This is not always like this, but depends on the individual circumstances of the case. And yes, you can see again, I've mentioned it already, but because it is so important, I will mention it again. Ability to influence and contributions cannot be used to prioritize negative impacts according to the CSDDD. We are seeing in Germany that companies are trying to use in particular leverage a lot in order to prioritize negative impacts. And obviously you will need to look when you come from the risk analysis and prioritization into defining measures and rolling them out. You will have to analyze what is my leverage in order to identify what kind of measures can I actually do. And you'll have to look at contributions, because contributions are relevant when looking already at the effectiveness element of appropriateness. It is very difficult to be effective without actually looking at root causes and addressing root causes. If there's a root cause to an impact and you're not trying to change that, will most likely not be effective. So in a contribution might be a root cause of an impact. So you need to look at that. And then also, again, obviously, in relation to the efforts, intensity of the measure, you will have to also analyze your contribution to an impact, but you don't do this in the context of the risk analysis. You do this at a later stage. And this is really important, because if you deprioritize a negative impact, for example, because you say, I don't have a lot of leverage, I don't think I can do very much here, you're creating systematic gaps in your risk analysis and also systematic gaps in your measures and in your due diligence system overall, because you might be required to do measures even though your leverage is very low, but the type of measure might be different. And it might also start with first taking measures to try to increase your leverage, for example, by collaborating with other companies together in a branch or multi-stakeholder initiative, but generally you can't deprioritize because of leverage. So yes, I have mentioned that meaningful stakeholder engagement is absolutely central to due diligence and also central to the risk analysis. And in the context of the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act, it does actually also require companies to engage with stakeholders, but it doesn't really spell out this requirement very specifically. And the CSDDD, in this context, I also understand it as a continuous improvement, building on also experiences made in the German context, really spells out when do companies have to do stakeholder engagement, how do they have to do stakeholder engagement, what are the steps that they have to do in this context. And in the context of the risk analysis, the CSDDD really clearly says it is necessary for the risk analysis. It is also necessary for other elements, but it's also necessary for risk analysis. And this is so important because when only engaging with suppliers in the context of the risk analysis, you are basically asking the actor who might be the source of a rights violation, who might be the perpetrator of a rights violation, whether or not they are responsible for such a rights violation. And this is, generally speaking, not very effective in order to get more clarity in relation to the situation at a supplier's level. There are many important questions in the context also of the risk analysis that you should be asking your supplier, in particular when it, for example, comes to management systems, to processes, to responsibilities that he has, maybe in relation to licenses from the government to operate and so on. But there are very many questions in relation to which actually stakeholders are the better addressees of these questions. And the CSDDD also defines who these stakeholders are. They are, for example, employees, members of neighboring communities. They might also be legitimate representatives of these people, for example, trade unions, labor councils, and also in relation to the environment. NGOs are also part of these stakeholders, quite obviously, because the environment cannot speak for itself. And in order to engage with stakeholders, not any type of engagement is allowed. It must be meaningful stakeholder engagement. And for this purpose, companies must provide information to stakeholders and also must protect participants from retaliation or retribution, and additionally even identify additional access barriers to the engagement and address them. And I've once gotten the question in a webinar that we had at the Helpdesk, why it is necessary to engage with stakeholders. And the person kind of insinuated that those are not experts. They don't really know anything about these questions. And in relation to most questions, I would say, no, actually they do. They know how long they're working. They know if they are getting any breaks. They know how much they're paid, if they're paid on time, and so on. So very many questions ideally answered by stakeholders, but there are some questions that might not be answered well by stakeholders. And in this context, the CSDDD requires companies to additionally consult with experts. Yeah, so, but not only I've mentioned consult with experts and stakeholders, companies also need to collaborate with their business partners in order to conduct a risk analysis. I've already mentioned that in relation to the risk analysis, the CSDDD requires companies to prioritize accessing information from the business partner where they're assuming the impact to occur in order to reduce the burden, the administrative burden in particular, on the business partner that is the link to this indirect business partner where they're assuming the impact to occur. The CSDDD in this context also requires the protection of trade secrets. And in this context, I think it's really important to look at what type of information is actually needed for the purposes of the risk analysis, and what type of information is actually needed for other parts of the due diligence system. You might need certain types of information for the risk analysis, and then come to the conclusion, oh, I actually need other information in addition to that, to then go from my risk analysis into designing and rolling out measures. And transparency, I feel that the term transparency in the supply chain is a term that is used very often in this context, and companies are, in particular German companies that are already implementing the Due Diligence Act, are facing challenges thinking about, okay, now I have due diligence obligations in the whole chain of activities. I need to make the whole chain of activities transparent. And in this context, first of all, it's important to note the German Due Diligence and Supply Chains Act is not a Tier 1 law. This is a very common misunderstanding, but generally it exists in relation to the whole supply chain, and the level of substantiated knowledge is very low, actually. So it's very easy to have substantiated knowledge and obligations in relation to the deeper supply chain. But when looking at what kind of information is necessary for the risk analysis in the different tiers of the supply chain, we must look at what can I do with this type of information? The risk analysis is not a goal in and of itself, but is a preparatory step to enable companies to define, design, and roll out measures. And the type of measures that companies can do in their own operations, in relation to direct business partners, and in relation to the deeper supply chains are very different. And in particular, they're very different because leverage is very different in these three different areas. Leverage typically is the highest in the own operations. This is where companies can actually directly rule and say, this is what we're doing. In relation to direct supply, you still have maybe a little bit, depends on the relationship as well, and depends on the market position. You might have at least some leverage, and you can use the contract as a tool to increase leverage, for example, and to then use this leverage. In relation to the deeper supply chain, leverage might be very different, because the deeper supply chain might consist, and often consists, of actors that are not known to this company, and where the company might have difficulties getting to know these different actors. And then the question is, how should we make them transparent? How should we start mapping these indirect suppliers? And is mapping them in all cases necessary, and it actually, in my opinion, is only necessary when it enables companies to roll out measures. And in many cases, knowing the identity of an indirect supplier does not enable companies to define different measures, because even if they knew how to get in touch with them, they might be very unimpressed by a Germany that is their tier 5 downstream customer and that buys a minuscule fraction of their overall production. So mapping who is who in the supply chain with the actual identity of these actors is not always necessary, because we must also look at the other side of the due diligence, to which the risk analysis is a preparatory step, must look at measures. And in some cases, a company might say, okay, I'm prioritizing this so high, I need to know who they are, because I will get in touch with them, because I believe I have enough leverage to then get in touch with them and to start to do measures with them. But in many other contexts, measures in relation to the deeper supply chain are actually not linked to getting in touch with this indirect actor, but are actually other types of measures. For example, working on own practices that are creating impacts, in particular design, purchasing, and distribution practices, which the CSDDD particularly addresses. They might also be working together with a business partner in order to enable them to roll out measures, for example, in the deeper supply chain, obviously not in a risk-shifting way. This is not allowed under the CSDDD. Or it might be working together with other companies, for example, in an initiative to increase leverage and to then potentially also even roll out measures that are addressing the situation from a more structural perspective, the situation on the ground. And only in exceptional cases would a company say, okay, I am going to address this indirect supplier. And it's also important to note that in this context, the CSDDD, maybe from the wording a little bit different from the Supply Chain Act, doesn't have this supplier-specific approach where you have to address an impact at this supplier, but actually looks at chains of activities. And so it is not important to know whether this piece of cobalt actually that has been manufactured over several steps and ends up in a product that I'm buying to use in my products, if it hasn't been actually picked, like grabbed out of mine in mine A, B, C, or D in a particular region. But it is important to know, okay, it comes from this region, there are these structural problems, and I'm starting to address them. And it's important to note in this context as well that actual connection of impacts to particular supplier and knowing whether particular suppliers where impacts occurred are part of my chain of activities when it comes to the deeper supply chain, deeper chain of activities is very difficult. And it's also something that is constantly changing. Not everyone is always making business only with the exact same other actors. Things are being traded at markets, at stock markets, and it might be very, very difficult to follow the actual identity of people having handled specific products. Yes. Looking at another tool that is very often used in the context of the risk analysis, but that is also playing a role not only in relation to the risk analysis, but also in relation, you can see it on the slide, in relation to monitoring and in relation to preventive and remedial measures. These are audits, and they are an important tool, but alone often not sufficient. In the past, there were many problems with audits. All of the most severe industrial disasters of the last decades happened on sites that had recently been audited and had been found to be compliant with all rules and regulations. And yeah, it's a little bit of a difficult situation for companies, because on the one hand, they might not have the expertise needed to determine the situation on site and therefore turn towards third-party auditors to verify the situation. But on the other hand, because of these problems with audit, because of audit fraud being so incredibly common, it's very difficult to rely on audits. The CSDDD sets forth a couple of requirements in relation to audits. You can see them on the slide. Must be objective, free from influence, free from conflict of interests, auditors must refrain from actions incompatible with their independence. Then there's certain requirements in relation to expertise and competencies of auditors and their accountability. But in addition to these requirements, the Commission will issue guidelines on fitness criteria and methods to identify the fitness of auditors and guidelines to monitor accuracy, effectiveness, and integrity of audits that shall also address shortcomings of ineffective audits. And I hope that with these tools, companies will have a practical guidance at hand to verify the reliability of audit results before using them in the context of their risk analysis or other elements of the due diligence process, and hopefully also against the background of these guidelines that the quality of audits in practice will improve so that they will become a more meaningful element of due diligence. So yeah, coming to my last slide, I believe I've mentioned several times that in particular in the deeper supply chain, but not only there, industry and multi-stakeholder initiatives might be a very important tool, and they can be a very important tool in relation to the risk analysis, but not only, they're also an important tool in relation to monitoring and communicating and preventive and remedial measures, and they are an absolutely essential tool when it comes to increasing leverage, in particular in a context where a company buys just a small fraction of the production of a direct supplier or even an indirect supplier. It will be very difficult for them to have any leverage, to be then using this leverage in order to gather information for the risk analysis, but also then at a later step roll out measures. And also in the context of initiatives, the Commission and member states shall provide information on initiatives, and the Commission will also issue guidance in relation to fitness criteria and methods to assess initiatives. So yes, I hope I could give you an overview of risk analysis and transparency under the CSDDD, and I'm handing back to you, Valentina.
Thank you so much, Michaela. This was very comprehensive, and I think you really gave us a deep dive into risk analysis, why it is so important in the context of the overarching risk management under CSDDD. So I will take with me, of course, the importance also of appropriateness when you really try to determine the best course of action. So depending on also where the risk is situated, you will take different actions, right, as a company, whether it is in your operations or those of the subsidiaries or the business partners chain of activities. So thank you for that. And just a reminder that you can ask questions by using the Q&A functionality. There are already quite a few interesting questions coming through, and we're going to do our best to address them during the Q&A that will take place later. But now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Raffaella Brito Marcellino, Senior Sustainability Expert at Amfori. She's going to share one example, right, of how companies can conduct risk assessment at the level of their suppliers to identify environmental risks and impacts. Of course, that's our example of how we would support companies with Amfori BEPI, but to also answer one of the questions that I saw popping up during the Q&A, actually, there are, of course, other realities out there. So this is Amfori, and over to you, Raffaella, please.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you also, Michaela, because it was a great presentation, and I think it clarified lots of questions and struggles companies have while trying to understand the background and the regulatory scene. And Amfori is actually there to support companies with a mission to facilitate those sustainable best practices with actionable solutions to help companies to do social and environmental due diligence of their supply chains. So the idea of Amfori is actually to put the different companies together so that they can use a collaborative system and have synergies within each other's on the suppliers that they share, and reduce audit fatigue and risk assessment fatigue and many other potential drawbacks of doing it by yourself. So as a collaborative initiative, I think we can move to the next slide, please. Amfori started more than 20 years ago in the 70s as Foreign Trade Association. And it started firstly with BSCI, that is the social supply chain due diligence system of Amfori. BSCI is very well known and it helps company a lot with their social due diligence, but then acknowledging the fact that companies also need support in their environmental due diligence processes, Amfori launched Amfori BEPI, the environmental brother of BSCI, in 2015-ish, and then it was recently revised 2 years ago. And last year, we officially introduced the Amfori BEPI Code of Conduct that moved it from a voluntary practice to a kind of a commitment from our members towards environmental due diligence using our actionable solutions and others that they might think are required as well, of course. So this is, in a nutshell, the history of Amfori. And Amfori BEPI support companies with different performance areas. So it looks into basically different scopes that companies might need to think of in terms of their environmental potential impacts and risks. So starting with environmental management system, that is the basics for it, but also looking deeper into other topics, as you can see here in the slides. Beyond just the qualitative and system practices, Amfori BEPI also support companies to collect metrics and qualitative and also quantitative data, for example, energy use, greenhouse gases emissions, water use, wastewater generation, waste generation, etc. So it's quite comprehensive and useful for CSDDD, but also for any other due diligence-based approach. So in the next slide, please, I'm going to quickly talk about an example of a BEPI journey for members. So it's very important to highlight here that Amfori is sector agnostic. So not only within the textile sector, but also with different sectors, different industries from different products can use Amfori. So from plastic products to textiles. So it's a framework that is applicable to all the sectors that you can imagine. And we can start here with materiality, and that's the ideal start of the BEPI member journey, and which means that companies are expected to do an environmental materiality to understand better what the topics are material to them, so that they can use this in their next steps of the journey. Amfori supports here with practical training. So we have recently revised materiality training that is a 3-step process, starting with e-learning and then going back to instructor-led sessions, and then 2 times, so that companies have time to try to do their homework and exercise and then check it again with the group. So it's very practical. Then after companies do their materiality assessment, they are expected to do supply chain mapping, as it was mentioned here before. So they can use, of course, criteria based on risk severity and likelihood to prioritize where to start. And I'm going to show also some practical solutions for Amfori, from Amfori to help in this step as well, where to start. But then after companies did their supply chain mapping and list their relevant business partners, they can use Amfori to practically conduct a risk assessment. And this environmental risk assessment, or risk assessment for BEPI, it's a framework that allows companies to ask their suppliers to respond a self-assessment questionnaire with the possibility to attach evidence and to also have in the end a risk profile that I will show later in the next slide, that helps company to red flag which areas need to be focused more in depth, and is a specific risk assessment for each producer. So it's granular, it looks into their management practices, it looks into their quantities, and it looks into how they are doing the different performance areas that are material to them. So there is a process that selects environmental areas according to the manufacturing processes that those factories have on site. So the idea is to also provide something that makes sense to them, and that will help members according also to their materiality assessment, because our members can select also performance areas that they need to report on, so that they are mandatory for this risk assessment. After the risk assessment is done, there is also the possibility to check the reality on ground with a monitoring activity that is an audit done by a third-party verification company. And this audit is always including a corrective action plan, where all the findings have suggestions on how to improve that are provided by the auditor in the closing meeting of the audit. And the idea is that companies can then improve based on those results. And beyond that, Amfori also have continuous improvement tools and support so that companies can move forward with it. Also capacity building trainings that are not only on how to use Amfori in general, but also in the different performance areas. So training, for example, for energy and climate, training for water and wastewater treatment, and etc., so that companies can grow and improve on this. Beyond that, we also have partnerships that we are starting now with one example in the chemical management for the fashion industry. We are now collaborating with ZDHC and their Supplier to Zero program, where we also recommend that suppliers that have high risk in the chemical topic and that are in the textile sector can use this approach, and the results will be shared automatically within our members and centralized in our platforms. And then after, of course, all these improvement activities are done, Amfori also has a set of tools to support members to monitor and to report their progress. Moving to more concrete examples in the next slide, here is how a risk score looks in the Amfori BEPI risk assessment. So just to show you quickly, but we have risk labels from low to very high. And beyond that, there is also, as I said, a list of quantitative data that is here inside this section that is called generic. And this gives the idea to the companies on their site maturity and also on potential consequences of the hazard, because this is being done based on risk severity and likelihood of occurrence. So in the next slide, quickly, I want to show you also very practically how members can use Amfori to go from different levels of risk. So I just showed you a very pragmatic and factory-based risk where members can look into the practice of each company that they have mapped in their supply chain. But then beyond that, we also have here a tool called Amfori Insights, where members can use different subtools that exist here. One of them is Amfori ESG Compass. That is this one that you're seeing here. And here companies can see risk indicators in terms of countries. So it's here geography risks. And this can be used for both materiality steps, but also for the beginning of the risk assessment process on where to prioritize. And here we have added different indicators from environment, governance, and social aspects. And all those risk indicators come from external sources, firstly, and those sources are credible and publicly available. And there is an explanation of the methodology and everything else inside the tool. And beyond that, now Amfori also added data from our internal database. So if you click here in show extended view, yes, you can move the slide, thank you. You will see here the extended view that will be launched very soon in a couple of weeks, where you will see this difference between external risk, these external indicators that I mentioned before, and internal risk, which is potential risk high flagged during the environmental monitoring. So only flagged in verified data. And these risks can therefore increase the external risk that was observed before. So as one example, if we would have one low risk in the external data set, but we saw that there is a frequent high risk in this specific topic within Amfori monitoring results, we will have a final risk label that will be increased for high. So the idea is to fine tune the external risk data source with our own ground observations here. And this will be available for our members very soon. So it's kind of a spoiler. And then in the next slide, please, beyond that, so beyond this geography risk, the good thing about Amfori Insights is that it's a centralized place that you can see the data coming from the different platforms and solutions of Amfori. So as a general remember for Amfori members or introduction for non-Amfori members, you can see here in this screen all the list of the data that you can dive into and dig into in environmental, social, and governance topics. So there is, for example, here Amfori BEPI supply chain export, which means that you can export all the supply chain that you mapped within Amfori and all the results that those different business partners or suppliers obtained in their assessment or audits within Amfori. Everything is summarized in a single Excel file so that you can easily report on. You can also see, for example, here inside this Amfori BEPI monitoring activity, the list of audits or monitorings that you did within Amfori and all the results with automatic generated graphs where you can take insights and directly report with it. So you can download either the Excel tables or the visuals that you see in the screens. And you can also therefore facilitate your due diligence and reporting very much. And I'm going to give you another example in the next screen. Next screen, please. Here is when you click in the environmental risk assessment, you can firstly see a visual like this. That is a first step because it will tell you which factories or sites have a valid environmental risk assessment, which factories or sites have not done an environmental risk assessment yet, and which sites have already have an expired risk assessment. So this is to give you one idea that it's a first way to filter and to also start your due diligence process, because of course you should focus on the ones that have not done a risk assessment yet and the ones that the risk assessment is expired. And you can click on each color on Insights and you will automatically see a table with the list of all the corresponding business partners. So it's quite practical and then you can work with them quite easily. And in the next screen, please, is another example that you can see. So you also see a summary of the results that the different business partners obtained in the different performance areas, so that you can also work with the ones that are high or very high risk, for example, which means that there is a potential likelihood for high severity and a high likelihood of the risk occurrence. So it's very important that you can also prioritize those firstly. And you can again click on each bar and see the corresponding business partners there. And on the next slide, please. Here, I want to give you another specific example of how you can use this to go granular and also to prioritize which factories you need to ask more evidence, which factories you need to audit, and so forth. You can also see all the questions and answers from the risk assessments as summarized in one single visual here in Amfori Insights. And as one example in question 1.1, we ask whether the site has an established environmental management system and whether it was audited, for example, by ISO 14001 or EMAS. And then if you click on this question and get this list on the next slide, please, you can see that in this example here, for example, 22% of your business partners have a valid ISO 14001 audit or EMAS certificate, which means that you don't need to potentially prioritize those to be audited or to dig deeper, and you would rather choose the other ones that don't have a formal environmental system, like this 6% here, or the ones that have a person responsible for it, but have not done any kind of environmental impact assessment and so forth. So it's also a good way for you to assess the maturity of your supply chain and to prioritize also based on it and avoid audit fatigue and double auditing. So because there is almost 80% of your supply chain in this example here that you can, of course, focus. And again, this is valid not only for the textile sector, but also for any other consumer goods or products that you operate with. In the next slide, so just to finalize it before we move, we are available to talk to you more if you want, so feel free to contact us and to interact. Amfori Insights is just one example of tools that you can use within Amfori sets of tools. So we have lots of other actionable solutions. So feel free to contact us and to learn more about it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafaela, for this very practical, hands-on explanation of how the Amfori platform and Insights work when it comes to Amfori BEPI as an example. So thank you for this. And now I would want to give the floor to Melina Kunde, project manager at the Secretariat for the Partnership on Sustainable Textiles, and Johannes Norpoth, human and labor rights manager at CNA. They will share with us first, Melina, the PST approach to transparency, and then we're going to have Johannes tell us a little bit about the CNA journey when it comes to transparency. Over to you, Melina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valentina, for the short introduction, and also thanks to you Michaela and Rafaela for the previous presentations. So I will just give a short introduction on the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative that has been initiated 10 years ago by the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in order to improve social and environmental conditions in the textile supply chain. So this is really an example that focuses on the textile supply chain now, and an MSI where actors get together and work along to really achieve substantial improvements here. Currently, the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, or in short, the PST, entails around 120 members from different stakeholder groups, being the private sector, non-governmental organizations, standards organizations, unions, and the German governments, because we strongly believe that no single actor can achieve these changes and improvements alone. Therefore, we're working on 3, as we call them, core elements, being implementing due diligence, supply chain transparency, and addressing 4 PST focus topics. The focus topics being living wages and purchasing practices, circular economy and climate protection, gender equality, and grievance mechanisms and remedy. And in all those focus topics, for example, we are offering tools and guidances for our members, and more importantly, implementing projects together to really achieve that impact we're aiming for. Today, I will dig a bit deeper into the second core element, supply chain transparency, but also will stick rather briefly to this to give a bit more space for a practical example afterwards. So when it comes to supply chain transparency, member brands of the PST are actively working on bringing more transparency to their supply chains. And in order to do so, the PST has a strategic cooperation with the Open Supply Hub since 2020. And the Open Supply Hub is a standardized and reliable database that shows data on production facilities to all actors in the industries. So the platform is not only available for the textile sector, but also to other sectors. That is important to mention here. On the right side, you can see a screenshot on how this platform looks like. When you here, for example, enter data that is introduced by, here in this example, the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. So every year, the PST uploads an aggregated list of suppliers of our member brands to the Open Supply Hub. Therefore, no conclusion to individual companies is given here. And that adds up to around 8,000 facilities that are submitted each year by the PST. PST members are also committed on integrating information and on gaining more knowledge and transparency on their deeper supply chain. And that is being started, for example, by, or in the next year, by including also the tier 2 suppliers in their list. And in order to do so, the member brands will be supported by the PST with, for example, webinars or materials. And I think that is already a really good notion to hand over to you, Johannes, who will share a more practical example from CNA, one of our members. Over to you.
Thank you, Melina, and happy to introduce the journey from C&A to supply chain transparency. And thanks to the previous speakers for really providing very deep insights to this, to the relevance of this topic already and how it would relate to future regulation. At CNA, we are also proud members of the PST since 2015 already, and also support the journey to more supply chain transparency among a multi-stakeholder initiative there. We are working on transparency on our supply chain already for quite some time, already before regulation started to kick in to address this topic. And I can assure you it's a journey that you engage on in this context. It will have some hurdles, but I think it gives you a lot of benefits as a company to improve your not only your due diligence processes, but also your overall company performance overall. So overall, I would say my general message is we are starting with transparency and aiming for even further traceability here, which may have benefits beyond compliance with CSDDD. I think our approach can be summarized with saying that we're starting with rather hands-on processes for supply chain transparency, and we are complementing that with trust-based transparency and a risk-based approach with further verification processes for traceability. And with that, maybe, thank you, going over to the next slide, which basically summarizes a bit our current status and approach to supply chain transparency. Let me give you as an introduction, I will speak here only as a human rights labor manager for the merchandise supply chain of C&A. So this is basically our approach regarding all the clothing items C&A sells in its stores. We definitely also have, in terms of indirect procurement, supply chains that maybe deserve further investigation for deeper supply chain transparency. However, overall, our assessment is that in terms of risks, the fashion supply chain is really the very high risk sector C&A engages in, and therefore we prioritize here also the efforts for more supply chain transparency on our fashion supply chains. Let me start basically with the right side here of this chart. So generally speaking, the fashion supply chain is divided into 4 tiers. We have full overview, like I would say most actors that have engaged in this kind of transparency over the past years of our final product assembly line. So we know all production units where production for C&A takes place, including subcontracting units on that level. And all of these are assessed and physically visited by own staff. Doing here also an additional due diligence check to assessments and audits through own verification systems and staff that is visiting factories, including worker interviews to get their views on relevant risks of the production floor. For tier 2, we have the similar setup already for all dyeing, washing, printing, and embroidery units, and all large wet processing units. We have full visibility of tier 2, so all material production, even beyond those sites mentioned here, based on supplier information. However, we are not yet able to really verify these sites through our own staff processes. For raw material processing, we also have, based on supplier information, all addresses and locations of production units known for the entire tier 3. For large wet process units, we also do assessments and on-site visits. This is based on a risk-based assessment. I would say that those wet process units have the highest environmental potential impact, so we focus our direct efforts there. We have a special process also for viscose and other man-made cellulosic fibers and synthetic fibers that I can explain in a bit. For tier 4, so raw material extraction, I've seen that this is also, I think, the production step that has raised some questions in the Q&A. We have at least reached the stage where we know the production country for each of the materials that we are using. And we have started to basically give more transparency to the original location of these raw materials through different steps. So one of the key processes we use is that we nominate our sources for viscose and man-made cellulosic fibers, and also for synthetic fibers. This is a way also to limit basically our risk also here in terms of human rights due diligence. So we are basically focusing on those entities for our deeper supply chain that have lower risk indications. Then for viscose and man-made cellulosic fibers, these nominations are also followed up with an audit system through Canopy. For cotton, we have additional projects currently looking for traceability to really be able to trace back to at least the more closely region of the original cotton farms. This is not a system that has yet rolled out through all our supply chain. Different cotton-specific initiatives that we are partnering with are developing different projects in that regard. And it's a key initiative for our materials team to further work on this. And yeah, as mentioned, I would say in summary, you could say it's a kind of hands-on approach to really ask your supplier for the respective information. It's important to follow up and especially dig deeper in those areas where your risk scoping tells you that basically your product, for example, has maybe higher risk indications in specific areas, and then use processes like nomination, further transaction certificates along the supply chain, and other deep dives that you can do also in cooperation with other actors to make sure you know more exactly where your deeper supply chain is located and to address the risks there. And as mentioned, I think it's a journey that is not yet at its final stage for CNA. We're constantly further improving on this, but I would say with a rather hands-on approach, we have started and reached already a kind of visibility that gives us a good feeling to be prepared for the CSDDD.
Thank you very much, Johannes, also for being so open and candid in the way you explained that this is a journey, right? This is a process. It's not the perfect way probably yet, but it's of course important to get started somehow. And thanks also for your willingness to share where CNA stands. And now we have received quite a lot of questions, and we have answered some of those in writing, but we hope to take quite a few orally, right? And over to you, Melina.
Thank you. Yes, maybe let's start with two short questions specifically on your presentation, Michaela. The first one being, you've referred on one slide to the climate plan. Can you explain what it means?
Yeah, so the CSDDD requires companies to, in addition to the due diligence process that revolves around human rights and the environment, to design, like adopt and implement a climate plan. And this is a plan that has to be based on quantitative and qualitative information and set forth specific emission reduction goals for scope 1, 2, and 3 with time-bound targets until specific deadlines, I think until 2030, until 2050, but it's not integrated into the due diligence process the same way as the other obligations. So companies don't have to do a risk analysis in relation to climate, don't have to do preventive and remedial measures in relation to climate, don't have to do a grievance mechanism in relation to climate. So it's a little bit outside of this due diligence process, and it's defined in the directive as a best effort obligation, which I find interesting because due diligence obligations in their nature already are best effort obligations, and the scope of the control by the authorities is a little bit reduced. So they only ensure that companies have adopted such a plan, and companies which are already reporting a climate transition plan under the CSRD are deemed to are complying already with this obligation.
Thank you, Michaela. We have another question specifically on one of your slides, being the one that you showed with the risk matrix. The question is, what if our company has no visibility from the origin of specific raw material, for example, aluminium? Should the approach be that it can be potentially come from a risk country? There seem to be ongoing internal discussions on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, the problem that we're having in this context in general is that we're working with a lot of uncertainty, and I think we need to accept that we cannot know everything. I think, at least in the times we're living in, it will not be possible to know who is making what, when, where, how, who is buying what from whom, where, for what price, where has it been before, and so on, because this is basically mapping the whole world and aspects that are also changing. So to some extent, we need to work with uncertainties and unknown and try to work also with approximations. Obviously, when a company has a very important raw material or semi-finished product that they're using that they have identified to be very high risk, they need to work on trying to create more transparency, better understand where it's coming from, what are potentially also several sources where it's coming from. But I mean, this is the often cited process of continuous improvement. We will not from tomorrow on know everything and then do one measure and then everything, all the problems will be corrected. But companies need to step by step get a better understanding of what's in their products, where is it from, how is it made, and so on.
Thank you for this answer. So maybe just a short question also for clarification, because it came up several times here. Again, when it comes to how deep into the supply chain, does the CSDDD clarify, clearly specify how deep into the supply chain we need to go? So if you're a textile company producing the finished product, do you have to need to have control over the cotton farming supply chain as well? How are you interpreting this aspect?
So we don't differentiate between direct and indirect suppliers, not in the context of risk analysis. There are differentiations because of leverage and contributions when it comes to measures, but in the context of the risk analysis, companies need to look at the whole chain of activities, starting from the production of raw materials until storage, distribution, sale, logistics of the finished products. And that means that there is no how deep, but you have to go into the whole chain of activities. But where you're actually focusing your energy on, based on this, you start with the mapping to identify which are the areas, which are the supply chains, potentially individual actors, but maybe you more have areas that are more high risk. This is where you're looking at. And when you identify that the farming of cotton, you figure out, okay, this is very high risk. And this might also stem from many unknown factors that you'd identified as high risk. Then you need to take a closer look there, considering what I've just mentioned, that, you might be working with approximations a lot because you don't know enough in relation to the situation on the ground. But there's a lot of information out there already in relation to deeper supply chains, in relation also to procedures to get a better understanding.
Thank you. We have one bit tricky question, so let's try this one. How do companies with several thousand supply chains and several hundred extreme risk supply chains with high severity and likelihood proceed as next steps after assigning general human rights and environmental risks based on product and country indicators if resources are insufficient to follow up on all extreme supply chains at once? For example, where to start with stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question of all questions, basically, is where to start when you realize there is too much going on and you need to you need to prioritize. So you need to basically do a mapping. Then what was just described, use branch and country factors, which is basically what we call an abstract risk analysis in the German context. And then the abstract risk analysis basically is a pre-step to prepare you for the concrete risk analysis. So you would base your more granular, more specific analysis on the results from the abstract risk analysis. So this doesn't necessarily mean that, let's say you've identified, I don't know, 500 actors, 500 supply chains that you have identified as high risk, that you ask them all of the questions, but instead that from the results of the abstract risk analysis, maybe you've identified like 5 hot topics, 5 risk topics in relation to them, and then you engage with them in that relation. It's very difficult if you say, okay, it's still too many. You need to kind of weigh them against one another and look at, okay, from all these super severe ones, which are the worst, and then you start from there, and then maybe gradually from your learnings of the first round of risk analysis, you can have a better approximation of what to look for and whom to maybe deprioritize a little bit and so on, or maybe you've built on information and or create a scalable process that reduces burden. And with the stakeholder engagement as well, I mean, you might need it in relation to all of the super high risk supply chains, but you need to start somewhere. And I would then use stakeholder engagement in the context in which I believe that engaging with them is more important than engaging with them in other supply chains. And if you come to the conclusion that it's all the same, then I mean, there's no good answer for that. I mean, you just start somewhere, and then you need to. I would document very well why you took such a decision, to be able to show this to the authorities and explain, okay, in relation to what is reasonably available to a company, which is part of appropriateness, it wasn't reasonably available to us based on our resources to look at 500. We only had resources for 200, and this is what we did. Yeah.
Thank you for answering, aiming to answer the question of the questions. Rafaela, I will move over to some questions for you. The first one being, you have shared examples from the textile industry. Can you explain how the tools are also applicable to other industries, and to what industries they are mostly relevant for, maybe?
Thank you, Melina. So this is a good question indeed. So Amfori is not a sector-specific solution, so it can be, the methodology behind can be applicable to different sectors. And mainly now it's more applicable for consumer goods when we talk about Amfori BEPI, because we have a list of manufacturing processes that are common in the consumer good manufacturing in different tiers. So I don't know, it could be processed food, it could be plastic goods, it could be glass like this, it could be any kind of products that you imagine in a big supermarket store. We try to make sure that we have a methodology to cover that. It could be that maybe one product that is very rare or very new is not fully covered with our manufacturing processes list, but then in this case, we would update it into a 6-month period maximum. So that's the idea, is that it's not sector specific, it's sector agnostic, and it covers mainly consumer goods sectors, but we are starting now to see a trend, and hopefully I think this is confirmed with more multi-tier supply chain mapping. It's also a solution that we are improved on our side, and with a better multi-tier supply chain mapping, we might get to other sectors that are more like heavy industrial productions that we don't cover yet, and that it will be a pleasure to also expand to those like extraction, for example. So now it's basically focused on consumer goods from the, let's say, the retail store until tier 1 and 2 and 3, and further we will develop it until we get better and cover better raw materials according to the interest of our members as well. I hope this answers, Melina.
I think so, yes. The next question would be, will the results of the BEPI also be able to use for the CSRD?
That's also a very interesting and important question. So CSRD sets a requirement for company to report on their material topics and how they do it in terms of their own operation, but also in terms of value chain, whether this is material to the value chain. So Amfori BEPI can help companies in different aspects, but it's not alone enough to support companies, because Amfori BEPI doesn't cover the company's own operation as a starting point. So we look into the supply chains. Looking into the supply chains, we help our members with the materiality part, as I mentioned before. So we have this materiality training, and now with a new tool that we are launching called Sustainable Textiles, we are also going to guide members with the materiality assessment part. And then if any topic is material to the company, not only in their own operations, but also in the value chain, then Amfori BEPI is useful for that, for understanding this topic a bit deeper. Let's say it's water pollution, and then the company can use BEPI to assess the risk and then to mitigate the risk and improve the performance of suppliers where there is this risk of water pollution, for example. So this is how I see Amfori BEPI contributing to the CSRD effort. And as I said, it's very important to know that this is applicable to the supply chain that was mapped within Amfori, of course, and to the supply chain part of it. So the own operation and the extended value chain that might not be covered from Amfori needs to be considered outside.
Thank you, Rafaela. So maybe another question on that, just to maybe summarize again. For a trading company, if their factory have BEPI, so does that then mean that they can fulfill the CSDDD requirements?
So that's again an interesting question. So the BEPI will of course support this company in their due diligence process, and if they are a factory that are part of BEPI, they did a risk assessment for BEPI, then they are working to improve on the high risk topics and area, and they are using this continuous improvement approach. It is of course helping them to support their clients to comply with CSDDD, because the clients will be probably the ones that need to be compliant. And but it's not something like a checkbox, you know, that you go do once and tick it and say, now it's done. I completed this risk assessment questionnaire for BEPI and it's done. It's actually a continual improvement process also for the factory in terms that they need to understand what they need to improve, what are their risks. And every time that they will do the risk assessment, we expect them to be to have improved practices, not only on processes and on policies, but also on even manufacturing processes change to decrease, I don't know, energy consumption and the greenhouse gas emissions as one example that is of the material, but also to have a biodiversity risk assessment and try to identify whether they could have any potential impact on biodiversity on the ground and try to cover this assessment a bit more and so forth. So it does help factory, of course, but it's not something that is a single checklist process, if I may say. So it's really a continuous improvement journey, and for supports also with the trainings, capacity building, and even the audit that goes on site. We have design questions that will go deeper, and the auditor will ask whether the site improved based on the last time. So the idea is that there are constantly more demanding targets and improvements to really drive sustainability.
Thank you, Rafaela, for answering these questions. Johannes, looking at you, there's a question. I see that you're already typing the answer, but maybe you might also reply that here live. What are the difficulties that you can find when you're conducting due diligence in deeper level tiers? What are the best approaches you would suggest, or have you considered in case of such challenges?
Very good question. I think there are numerous challenges that you can encounter here. I think, generally speaking, to do an abstract risk analysis or a risk scoping, I think for the fashion supply chain, you have a wide range of data and sources out there to really be able to scope risks of also your deeper supply chains quite well, especially if you have at least an indication of countries and regions where your deeper supply chain is located. I think the challenge is sometimes on a very technical level then to really verify the exact and also potentially shifting production units of your deeper supply chain. So to really be sure that it's spinning mill A and not spinning mill B. And I think, as mentioned, one of the ways how we are working on this is to start basically confirming supplier information through own assessment processes, through chain of custody tracking, especially for some of our materials. And this nomination processes that I've mentioned for specific materials, because that limits a bit the way how much that deeper supply chain can then shift and how you can, I would say, steer your supply chain also to less risky sources in your deeper supply chain. But definitely this is a process with a lot of challenges in between. I would say also relying on supplier information also always gives you the challenge to sometimes simply clarify whether a spinning mill with one address which is very close to the name and very similar address of another spinning mill is indeed the same entity, or maybe two different ones. So these are quite detailed technical challenges that you encounter as well.
Thank you, Johannes, for this very transparent, but also hopeful, a bit hopeful answer, I think, and really good final words, I think. Valentina, on that note, I think I will hand over back to you. Thank you, everyone, for all your really interesting questions. We are trying to also answer as much as we can in writing. Unfortunately, we have limited time in this webinar, but I hope we already addressed some of the important and major questions, I hope. On that note, back to you, Valentina.
Thank you so much, Melina, and thank you also to Johannes, Rafaela, and Michaela for your willingness to share your expertise, your knowledge, your experience on this topic. And the feeling is that we have only just scratched the surface. So maybe also for us, a point of reflection whether we might want to have another conversation on this very topic, maybe trying to narrow down a particular aspect maybe of the risk analysis and risk assessment. So it has been really interesting, and there has been really a lot of good content shared, a lot of good experience. I just want to say that we're going to try perhaps and address some of the questions also offline, because we have received really very many, and I think it is a pity a little bit that we leave them unanswered. So we will try to see what we can do to address some of those also afterwards. As a point of reminder, maybe if we could move to the next slide, we have already planned a next webinar of the series on due diligence laws and practice. This one will be, again, a joint undertaking with the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles and with the support of the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights. And we're going to try and unpack the EU Forced Labor Regulation. And we will also try to understand how this fits within the broader due diligence framework that has been established by CSDDD. So we really look forward to unpacking this other piece of legislation that has been nearly finalized as part of the Green Deal. So do follow us, do register in case of interest. And I want to thank you all again for your interest, active participation, and to the next. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.